All right, folks. Big Paul here today with Rick Collins, attorney to the entire bodybuilding industry. How's it going, Rick?
That's a big job, Paul. Thank you. How are you doing? Good to see you.
Good, man. I remember reading your articles. I forget what magazine it was, years ago, a long time ago. Remember, it was I think it was Legal Muscle or something like that. You had way back in the day.
So yeah,
we still read magazines before everything migrated to social media.
Yeah. That's it's funny. I started writing for the now defunct Muscular Development magazine in 2001.
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And that was back when we got information from the print news. That was before social media even existed. And so I wrote that column for 25 years in that magazine, and I wrote a book called Legal Muscle, which was sort of I guess it remains the only book that dealt with steroids and performance-enhancing drugs in the context of law, policy, sports, medicine, all respects. And so that was written in 2002. So I've been in this game a long time. As you know, I came from the gym culture. I was a competitive bodybuilder myself before I went to law school. Was a prosecutor, putting the bad guys away in jail for 5 years. Then started doing criminal defense and representing people and their rights. And over the last 20 or 25 years, my practice really is sort of crisis management in the fitness world, whether it's representing dietary supplement companies, energy drink companies, sports nutrition companies that get a class action lawsuit or some regulatory issue, or whether it's an athlete who's accused of taking banned substances in a sport, or whether it's a doctor who's over prescribing testosterone in the eyes of some medical licensing board or administrative body, or whether it's representing underground labs. And I probably represented more underground lab dealers and manufacturers than anybody. So I love what I do. I'm probably one of the few in my criminal defense practice. I'm probably one of the few lawyers who never really has to represent people who physically, economically, or sexually harm other people directly. Right. Most of my practice is people who are involved in the bodybuilding community and fall under laws that exist in the United States that are not the same laws as exist elsewhere. As you probably know, in the UK and Canada, possession of an anabolic steroid isn't an arrestable offense, and in many countries you can buy anabolic steroids over the counter. In this particular country, and in the laws of most states within it, it can be a misdemeanor to just possess any amount of an anabolic steroid, and it can be a felony certainly to sell it or distribute it, but in some states actually just to possess it as well. So I've made a practice in the bodybuilding industry, the fitness industry. I do some other things in the fitness industry, but I love what I do, Paul, and I'm grateful to have the unique set of skills that lets me do it.
It's interesting to think about every body that's potentially competes in bodybuilding is a potential felon. Really. I mean, and these are usually high performing people in life. They're usually successful in life. I think I forget where the study was that I saw, where the average steroid user, talking about income brackets and whatnot, how they're usually higher income family people, normal people, that because they choose to participate in a sport are considered criminals. It's really weird, man.
It is. So yes, I'm not sure they would be felons under the law if they're just possessing for personal use, but they're certainly federal drug criminals under the law if they're possessing it outside the scope of a prescription. And it's funny that you mentioned that study, because that was my study. I was one of the four co-authors on that study. I was happy to participate with 3 people much smarter than me who did the survey of 2,000 non-medical anabolic steroid users, and just looking at what their motivations were, demographics and doses, which drugs they were using. It was published in, I think it was 2006. The name of the study is A League of Their Own. Anybody can pull it up. It's on open source. It's on the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. So if you just Google that with A League of Their Own, you can read it. And you're right. Steroid users are certainly, they don't fit the typical profile of the what we would think of as a drug addicted person, or a person who's using traditional drugs of abuse, typically in their late 20s to early to mid to late 30s, gainfully employed, typically, family people, making on average above average income, on average better educated than the median. And so you have a demographic that is very different than what the media would portray. I mean, when you read about steroids or hear about them in the news, it's typically two profiles, right? It's the cheating athlete, the guy who's, the Lance Armstrong, the person who's been beating the system or cheating other athletes out of some fairness in sport. Or it's the teenager who has some catastrophic, casualty, and it's connected to anabolic steroids. And both of those are tiny fractions of the overall pie chart of people using anabolic steroids. The vast majority who are using steroids non-medically are not competing in any sport at all, haven't played since Little League. I mean, really.
Right.
And most people who are using anabolic steroids non-medically are not teens. They're not even in their early 20s. Most are in their later 20s and 30s. So there is a disconnect between what the public typically thinks about this population and who they really are.
I mean, it's interesting because they're lumped in the same category as people sleeping in a tent under a bridge and robbing a convenience store, but they're nothing like those.
No, it's funny that famously, a former San Diego district attorney once said, nobody ever knocked over a liquor store for anabolic steroids. And that's, there's truth to that. It's steroid use, and any drug can be abused. And certainly, you and I can talk about, I think we share a lot of views that at the high end of dosing and duration, you've got some potential serious medical consequences that you're risking. But, generally, steroids are certainly not connected with the kind of social blight, the homelessness, somebody lying in an alley, unable to get up, lost their job, lost their home because they became, quote unquote, addicted to anabolic steroids. That doesn't happen. That's not real.
No, I mean, one could argue that alcohol is more harmful. It's an interesting thing to think about.
One could certainly argue that alcohol may be the most harmful, of all drugs in many ways. Having been a bouncer when I was in college for a number of years, I can tell you, it wasn't people who were smoking marijuana who were, the trouble that had to be thrown out of the bar. It was the guy who drank too much, and certainly, when you look at certainly on a overall picture, the damage that alcohol does to people who are alcoholics and who abuse, is substantial. On the other hand, you can't use the most extreme examples of abuse to justify policies with respect to everybody, as if everybody falls in that category. Same with steroids. If you're looking at the guy who's using 3 or 4 grams of gear a week as sort of the poster child for all people who use anabolic steroids non-medically, I don't think that's fair any more than it would be fair to say that, okay, I'm going to look at the guy who puts down a quart of scotch every night as being representative of the person who wants to have a glass of Cabernet with dinner. So context matters. They always say the devil's in the dose, right? The difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose very often.
Yes, that is a big difference. It's a weird time, man, that we live in. There seems to be an assault on, we talked about it a little bit before, but assault on freedom, and specifically things that seem to be enhancing performance or even masculinity. It's really weird that we talked about the New York laws for banning supplements for teenagers. It's a very odd thing that's going on right now.
Yeah, and certainly there's different motivations for why some of these things are falling on the radar screen for restriction. But there is definitely a common thread, and that is with respect to freedom and choice and autonomy and making your own personal decisions. We always hear the phrase, my body, my choice in one specific context. And,
Right.
we don't apply it to other contexts,
No.
including the mature adult use of non-medical, steroids for cosmetic purposes, which is really why most people are using it. But that is not a valid reason for a doctor to prescribe. That doctor would be committing a felony if he were to prescribe a course of anabolic steroids to a healthy adult purely for the purposes of building muscle. So yeah, there's definitely some double standards with respect to the New York law that just went into effect. Talk about timing, 2 days ago. So on Monday, the New York law took effect, and it restricts the sale of any kind of muscle building or weight loss dietary supplements to anybody under the age of 18. It applies to brick and mortar stores. It applies to online sales into the state of New York. Straight protein products are excluded. So like a whey protein canister is not part of this law. But creatine explicitly is listed as one of the problems, as well as like Garcinia cambogia and green tea extract and a few other things that would be, potentially stimulant weight loss sort of dietary supplement ingredients. The law is very, very vague as to what else might be considered. It could be based on ingredients. So if you put one of those ingredients into a protein powder, well, that would then be restricted under the law. It's also what you say about the product. So if you say that a particular supplement is good for building muscle, that alone could put it into the restricted category. There's also language in the law that says that where the retailer places the products. So if you took a product and you put it on the shelf with other muscle building products, even if it wasn't a muscle building product, that could be a basis for a violation of the law. It's not a criminal law. It's a civil violation. So each and every time that a brick and mortar retailer or an online retailer sells in violation of this law, it's a $500 fine. And it could open up the violator to a injunction, which could ultimately stop them from selling products. So it's something to be aware of if you're in the supplement industry, if you're a seller of products that either are purported to build muscle or to enhance body composition, to lose fat or gain muscle or lose weight. You certainly should be aware of the law and be aware that if you're selling products into New York State or in New York State, you potentially have to look at that and maybe change some of your standard operating procedures.
I would think if I owned a supplement company, I would seriously consider just saying screw New York State and not sell there.
Yeah, well, that would be unfortunate for a lot of people. It's the question's going to be on online sales. You have to, whoever delivers the product has to make sure that the person receiving it is over the age of 18. And, a lot of these carriers may not be doing that. I know there's for alcohol sales online, they'll sometimes require a signature for over 21. I'm not sure there's any infrastructure for over 18. So it's really what the law requires, what it says, what's inside the law, what's outside the law is really anybody's guess. 2 trade associations have filed lawsuits to try to stop the law from taking effect, with a preliminary injunction having just been denied last week, which means the law wasn't stopped from going into effect. Where it's all going to fall, whether it'll be upheld in the long term after court challenge, we don't know. But that's what's going on that's what's going on in my state here in New York.
That seems like an insane assault on freedom to me.
Yeah, we've talked about creatine monohydrate is probably the most studied sports nutrition ingredient in terms of safety and efficacy. And there's certainly a lot of data that would suggest that people who are, in their mid to late teens, or people who who are in their mid to late 80s will benefit from incorporating creatine monohydrate into their diets as some supplemental, amount. But that law was really spurred not primarily by concerns over safety or adulteration or things like that, which we hear a lot of criticism in the supplement industry about things like that. It was really because the claim is that weight loss and muscle building products in the dietary supplement market cause eating disorders. That's the claim. And so an organization out of Harvard called Striped is an activist organization that has presented their claims and their views to legislators in the state of New York, and they're doing it in other states. So even though we're talking about New York, this is going to be an issue in many other states, because the activists who accomplished this in New York certainly now are emboldened to, if it worked in New York, it's coming to Massachusetts, and it's coming to California, and it's coming to more and more states. And those politicians in those states will have to decide whether they want to really scrutinize the connection. Do supplements really cause eating disorders? Or do they want to go along with it because it can always be couched as saving the children, right? And politicians generally, never get removed from office because they took a policy that favored saving kids. So I think that's what we're going to see more of, and I'm not sure that it's going to stop in New York at all.
I remember in the 90s, it was video games that were going to cause kids to go crazy, and we needed to be protected from. And I built an entire career off of playing. And I had IT, and I built my entire career based off of starting in video games. So I've never met anybody that's anorexic that takes creatine. I don't know.
Right. And look, not to, I don't want to in any way minimize the seriousness of eating disorders. Certainly, addressing those issues among teens is a worthy goal. I don't think this does it. I think this actually distracts from how we really should be addressing that problem, number one. And then number two is that, I'm not sure that in the big picture that an overabundance of concern for exercise and dieting is the problem for the majority of teens today. We have, the statistics show quite the opposite, that there's an epidemic of obesity. Childhood obesity has hit, high levels. Kids are not going to the gym too much. They're actually generally not going to the gym enough. They're living sedentary lifestyles. They're on their phones. They're not active like, in my generation or yours. There's less activity. They're eating more junk food, and they're, fatter than ever. And so, that I think that's a problem that, also needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, we don't see anybody in legislative bodies looking to try to increase people, young people's interest in going to the gym or in eating healthy diets or staying out of fast food restaurants, etc.
It's weird. It's like we've almost embraced mediocrity and being obese versus being there's a cult of fit shaming now. It's really weird, man.
Yeah. I wrote an article, one of the last articles I wrote for Muscular Development was an article that looked at mannequins. I was walking through a department store, in a mall, and I looked in a window of a clothing store, and then they now have mannequins which are, to be more inclusive, look more like the average person, I guess, in the population. So you've got pot-bellied mannequins. It was a men's clothing mannequin. He was wearing like a bathing suit, and had like a 44-inch waist with a big pot belly hanging over the bathing suit top. And it's like, so yes, I think whether that's embracing mediocrity or simply trying to be more appealing to the person who can look and say, well, I've got a belly like that. So that's how I'd look good in that bathing suit. I don't know if that's what sells. I guess the statistics and data will come out on sales of these items. What should a mannequin look like? Should a mannequin look like the average person who potentially would buy the product, or should the mannequin look like the ideal? Should a model be like, wow, that looks good, and I'd look better if I wore that? I don't know. Those are, I think, philosophical questions that our society is now struggling with, right? At what point are you, when you want to make everybody feel included, at what point does that just sort of, average things out to mediocre?
It's really weird. Like when I was growing up, people would aspire to be strong and fit. Like I remember seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger in movies, and I'm like, I want to look like that guy.
Right.
I just remember that being
Sure.
as a kid, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It's just odd how it's turned on its head.
Yeah, well, I
It's
think part of it is certainly, I've talked to a number of people about this. A friend, Dr. George Toulianos, and I have spoken about it. Ali Gilbert from Silverback and I have talked about it. And, there is a pushback both on muscularity and masculinity, I think,
yeah,
in our society. And muscularity is, well, I think the average person is evolutionarily designed to fear the larger, stronger, rival, right? So, bullies have always been depicted as the Blutos or Brutuses of
yeah.
Popeye, right? The guy with all the muscles, that's the guy who's, to be feared. And I think on some subliminal level, the possibility of somebody being larger, stronger, and potentially having, control, dominance is something to be feared. So there is a pushback, I think, against what appears as dominance on a deep-seated level. And also the connection of hypermuscularity with steroid aggression is an issue, right? I mean, that's what really fanned the flames of roid rage as a narrative for decades, right? The idea that steroids will make you big and jacked, and now you're going to be beating up all the smaller people. So that's there's a lot of reasons, I think, and most people don't fit that category. The average person is we now have 60% overweight, obese, up to 70%.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So people, it's kind of like the Planet Fitness marketing, right? Where the bodybuilder is looked at as the person you want to kind of shove out the back door, and the person who's inclusive of whatever their weight, healthy at any weight kind of mantra has become much more acceptable and accepted in society. There's a whole fat pride movement, as that is pushing the narrative that you can be healthy at 500 pounds, and certainly you can be beautiful. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and everybody should be comfortable with who they are. Although I think the balance in life is sort of being comfortable with who you are, but working towards some level of improvement, both
Right.
physically, mentally, from an educational standpoint. You got to keep growing. If you're stagnant, if you're completely complacent, I love myself just as I am, you're never going to change. You'll never progress. And I think that leads to the whole idea of safe spaces, where you should never be challenged. You should never be made to feel uncomfortable ever under any circumstances. You have to be comfortable. To me, that is an extremely damaging mentality. And I think that you should always have some level of discomfort, because only from discomfort does growth come. I make the analogy, as bodybuilders, we learned this.
Right.
We've lived, slept, ate, and breathed this. This is in our DNA, right? The idea that if you go to the gym and you never do that 10th rep, you never go beyond, if you never get into that pain zone, if you're never challenging yourself, if you're always doing a set that you finish and you felt completely comfortable, you will literally never grow. You'll never make any progress. And so I think that same mentality applies to everything, whether it's, pushing yourself physically so that you can gradually make progressive resistance, right? You're progressively advancing against resistance. You have to have resistance in order to progress, to move forward. So I think that's what we need to do more than ever, is challenge ourselves. And even if it's not physical, it's just social or philosophical. Expose yourself to ideas that make you uncomfortable, that ideas you don't agree with. And I think one of the problems, particularly for younger people, is that they're getting indoctrinated into bubbles of one side or another, and they're not being exposed to the alternative viewpoints, and that would challenge them and maybe make them rethink some beliefs. And I think that's true. Social media is not helping that either. We all wind up being fed algorithms of information that we already agree with, rather than being presented with ideas that would make us say, well, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way.
It's the ultimate echo chamber.
Right.
Confirmation bias with
Right.
social media. Yeah, everything I've ever done in my life where I have improved has always been areas that have challenged me, gotten me out of my comfort zone. I played sports when I was younger. I've done, have 2 degrees, just things that where you get out of your comfort zone and do stuff. I mean, how the social media stuff, getting on and doing these interviews and things, were really weird for me, but it helps with personal growth. It's just, I don't know, it's just an odd thing to me that we embrace mediocrity, and like the whole Planet Fitness thing. Can you imagine if somebody opened up a gym and said there were no fat people allowed?
Yeah. Yes, it would.
I mean,
would not fly.
Would not fly. It's okay to fit shame, but it's not It's so odd to me. And the whole roid rage thing is just ridiculous too. I'm probably one of the most chill guys you'll ever meet, and I haven't, for crap's sake, I haven't had a speeding ticket in 30 years.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm pretty laid back.
Yeah, and I think the old adage is, if you were an asshole to begin with,
right,
you'll be a bigger asshole on steroids. If you were walking into the bar at 180 pounds and looking to fight somebody, now if you walk into the bar at 240 pounds, you're gonna be a bigger problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because the bodybuilding community, my experience, has been very welcoming. Most everybody's very, everybody's great that I've talked to. It's very supportive for the most part.
Yeah.
The guys that are successful at it anyway.
Yeah. I sometimes, I think of the gym culture generally, and maybe it's different in other areas, but certainly in the gyms that I've trained in, I've trained in many gyms in many places where there's a diverse clientele, where there's people who are of various ethnicities, people who are Black, people who are white, there's men, there's women. It's not an identity politics situation. Color in the gym doesn't matter. The gender really doesn't matter.
No.
I if you need a spot, if you need a training partner, it doesn't. Yeah, you're going to pick the guy who's more muscular, so that if you've got 405 on the bench, you don't want it to be laying on your chest if you get a little overly confident, right? So you may be screening for certain attributes, but color's not one of them, and ethnicity isn't one of them. And in some ways, I wish that model of the bodybuilding community could be a broader model for society in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, the community's been great to me, and I've been involved in it off and on for 30 years. I've had nothing but positive things to say about it. I've seen so many people turn their lives around by getting, I talked to a guy yesterday, reformed addict that got himself straight and got into bodybuilding. It's a more productive use of his energy and efforts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, if you're completely satisfied with the way you are, you're never going to change. Bodybuilding, I think, it's inherent for somebody to put the amount of time and effort and discipline into the amount of training that's necessary, the amount of food, eating behaviors that are necessary. You really have to be motivated, and
Yep.
you really have to, where does that motivation come from? I guess there are some people who say, well, I just want to be Mr. Olympia, or there's some sort of, athletic pursuit aspect of it. But I think for most people, it comes from some dissatisfaction. Either,
Yep.
most people who start bodybuilding were too thin, or were too fat, or maybe they had an addiction to a different drug, and so they wanted to now substitute some sort of, another alternative to it that would be healthier. And so it's generally an overcompensation. It's overcompensatory behavior where, I'm going to go, I'm going to hit the mark and then go beyond. There's probably some level where you look fit and you're healthy, that if you have the mentality of a bodybuilder, you will go beyond that level. You will keep pushing it. Well, I want, the average person, maybe we're not meant to bench press, 450 pounds. Maybe we're not meant to have a 20-inch arm, but the bodybuilders want that, and they keep pushing for it. And, the motivation that starts it all, I think, is one that's good. At some point, yeah, sure, I guess anything can be taken to excess.
Right.
And but I don't think bodybuilding is really out of step with that. I think bodybuilding is just an example of what we do in so many different areas. We overcorrect problems. We're by nature, that's what we do, right? So when you look at almost all the problems that we're having today in the country, a lot of it is because of overcorrection of one type or another.
Yep.
We had, give an example, we had problems in state mental facilities, psychiatric facilities back in the 70s and 80s. There were horror houses, all sorts of abuses going on. And so, we needed to correct that problem. But we overcorrected it by closing them all down and not substituting them with halfway houses. And all of those people who needed psychiatric treatment then became homeless people. And they're now what we refer to as, people experiencing homelessness on the streets. Many of them are drug addicted or psychiatrically challenged. They're people who need help, and they need treatment. And many of them need to be in safe, secure places where they can get that treatment. We just don't have those. So we overcorrected that problem. The drug war itself was an overcorrection, right? Sure. People, dying from overdoses, using terrible drugs, losing their homes, their families, terrible. When we began a process of mass incarceration for nonviolent crimes, though, at some point, the overcorrection caused more problems than the original problem did.
Yeah.
And so now we're trying to reverse on that. And in some places, we're overcorrecting in the opposite way, so that now we have, in the spirit of harm reduction, in some places, we've now got homeless camps of drug addicts who are now perfectly happy, living on the streets and wreaking havoc in urban areas that, in the effort to sort of overcorrect the mass incarceration, we're now in some places supporting and even encouraging, arguably, the use of these drugs and the continuation of the addiction. So we need to find, there's some balance in life, and finding that balance, whether you're a bodybuilder or whether you're a state or national policymaker, finding balance is really the key.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They're definitely. My brother-in-law is a federal marshal in Portland, and he's told me the horror stories there. I mean, that place is crazy, man.
It's sad, it was I remember being in Portland. It was a beautiful city. Even San Francisco is just a beautiful city that has been destroyed by policy.
Yeah, I was recently out in Portland and walking through a park, and there's just needles laying everywhere.
Yeah,
They're just littering the ground, and people passed out everywhere. It's
right.
nuts, man.
Imagine having children or being an elderly person, and being in that area.
Yeah, and it's funny, and then people were worried about bodybuilders.
Right. Yeah.
That's the part that's nuts to me. Yeah, they're over. Speaking of overcorrection, there does seem to be an assault on freedoms. We talked about that a bit going on right now, but especially it seems the government is more aware of things like SARMs and peptides and all of these. I guess former gray market stuff or currently gray market stuff. It seems to be that now is under attack.
Yeah. So stepping away from the philosophizing a little bit and into what my day-to-day job is. Yeah, I've got a number of SARMs cases now pending. These are federal criminal cases where typically the FDA investigates people who are either selling SARMs or selling peptides of one kind or another under the guise of research chemicals, which the government views as fraudulent under the circumstances. And so I've got cases in a number of different states. SARMs do not comply with the requirements of a dietary ingredient. So they're not vitamins, they're not minerals, they're not herbs. They're synthetically created molecules they don't fit the definition of a dietary ingredient. So they can't be sold as dietary supplements. There were two efforts, bills that were introduced in 2018 and 2019 federally by Congress to take SARMs and make them Schedule III drugs, controlled substances like anabolic steroids, to put them into that same law with anabolic steroids. Those failed. They didn't pass. And I think there may be some misunderstanding by industry that because those passed, people may think, well, then it's legal. So because those laws failed, it's fine to sell. It's not fine to sell as a dietary supplement because there's a separate body of law, not in the DEA's jurisdiction, but in the FDA's jurisdiction. And those laws really prevent the sale of anything that is not a proper dietary supplement ingredient.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, there's a lot of these gray marketplaces that sell that stuff. I think I've seen a couple of them recently. I saw some YouTube channels get taken down because of people representing places that were selling this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's still going on, and I'm sure I have more clients coming.
And what exactly are they charging these people with that are?
So the basic charge is introducing a misbranded or adulterated drug, an unapproved drug, into interstate commerce with the intent to defraud and mislead the Food and Drug Administration. So if you call a SARM a dietary supplement and it's not, that is, they claim, for the purposes of avoiding calling it what it really is, which is a unapproved drug. I mean, Ostarine is actually in the pipeline as a potential pharmaceutical. So you can't sell these things as dietary supplements. When you label it as a research chemical and you call it for research purposes only, not for human use, you explicitly are saying, I'm selling this to people for purposes other than them using it. That's not for human use. But then you're shipping it to college dorms and you're responding to emails from youngandjacked@gmail.com, and you're marketing it in a bodybuilding forum. The devil's in the details, and the government would see that as fraud. The reason that you're saying it's not for human use is because you don't want it to be classified as a drug. You want it to be looked at as like a chemical to avoid the requirements that drugs need to be approved by the FDA. So there's a lot of defenses that I present in these cases, and I've been very successful in beating down the government from what its initial position is on these cases. But people should be aware that you can't call something an orange if it's an apple, and because purely for the purposes of avoiding the tariff on apples, and or for some regulatory evasion purpose. So yeah, so those are problems that's going to keep going. Obviously, I do get a lot of calls from people who are either involved in the peptide research chemical business or are looking to get into it, who call me and say, listen, I want to do this completely legally. I want to sell peptides as research chemicals. Is that legal? And the answer is, there is a legal way to do it. There are chemical supply companies that do sell these peptides and other drug ingredients, active ingredients in drugs, to universities and cancer centers and researchers. But you're never going to be able to make money doing that as a legitimate business, as a practical matter. So in theory, you could do it, but you'll never have a customer. If you want to make money at it, you're going to have to sell it to, the guys in the gyms who want to use it for themselves. And you can't say it's not for human use when you know that that's what you're selling it for.
Well, there clearly is an organized effort right now to go after that stuff, because I saw a lot of social media channels, I'm not going to mention names, but people that got taken down for representing a peptide and research chemical place, advertising it on their channels. And there was some pretty big, a couple months ago, I saw quite a few people get taken down for that. They lost their social media presence because of it.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's cool to talk about, and maybe we can finish by talking about this a little bit, is what happens when the government works with social media platforms together to censor, limit, or suppress ideas, information, conversation.
I've been party to it myself.
Okay. I mean, a lot of guys have, a lot of podcasters have, a lot of social media influencers have. And so brief background. So of all the amendments, the first one, the First Amendment deals with freedom of speech, even before any of the others. Right. And so, we have an amendment in our Constitution which says that the government can't suppress free speech. You should be with very limited exceptions, right? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and there are various realistic restrictions, but by and large you can't suppress ideas. And the idea that the First Amendment was meant to protect safe, agreeable speech is a fallacy. The concept behind the First Amendment is to protect speech that is not not favorable, that is not necessarily in the wheelhouse of everybody's agreement. It's to protect speech that is challenging. It's to protect speech that is unpopular. And so the government can't crack down on those sorts of narratives. But what's happened is that in some ways, it appears that the government has used social media as its proxy to do with influencers and podcasters and those who have an audience on social media, what the government can't itself do directly. And so a lot of this has to do with some of the big recent health issues that, were part of national policy. And so there was a case that was brought by a few state attorneys general, which became collectively known as Missouri versus Biden. And I say this not, in a partisan way. And what I'm going to describe is not meant to say anything about partisan politics. It's just to talk about this case, because the administration was sued by these state parties, and it went to court. And in court, it was decided by a judge who issued a very long, like 90-page decision. And the decision is worth reading. And the fact that most Americans never heard of that, aren't even aware of this case, Missouri versus Biden, is problematic, because I think the news, the legacy news and the mainstream news really didn't make any effort whatsoever to advise about it. But if you read the decision is absolutely harrowing. And what it says is that the judge found evidence that the White House, that the FBI, that the FDA, that the CDC, that various government regulatory bodies were pressuring social media platforms at that time to either downgrade, shadow ban, censor, deplatform, or otherwise restrict the presentations of narratives that didn't comport with what the government's narrative on health issues at the time was. And obviously the government couldn't have cracked down directly. That would have been a violation of free speech in the First Amendment. But the First Amendment only applies to government action. It doesn't apply to private action. So the various platforms began doing that, so that podcasters, influencers, others, who had audiences in social media, suddenly they found themselves blacklisted. Suddenly they found themselves deplatformed. Suddenly they thought that they were wondering why they only had a handful of views of a particular post that they made. And what the judge found was that there were actually meetings being held between government actors and the social media platforms, where the government actors would actually point out things that they would suggest were problematic. When you read the decision, it almost sounds like Tony Soprano showing up at your office and saying, look, I'm not saying what's going to happen. I'm just saying it would be better. Be better for you if you made some of these changes. Well, I'm not telling you what to do, but you probably should think about doing this. And of course, the platforms began to act in accordance with what the government regulators were telling them. And so the judge issued a decision which, really is scary. And so the case then went to the Court of Appeals in the circuit. And the circuit court is the highest level courts. Those are the highest level below the Supreme Court, one step below. And the circuit court could have reversed the decision and said, well, that's just one judge, and that judge isn't reading the information. That's not really what the data says. But that's not what happened. The circuit court actually found that virtually all of it was true, all of it was going on, and all of it was extremely disturbing to anybody who is a believer in the First Amendment. And what they found was that, they also issued a long and scathing account of what was going on. They did find that there was insufficient evidence with respect to a few of the government agencies. And so it was limited to, instead of, 15 agencies, it was 12 agencies that did it, kind of thing. At that point, the media did cover it in, page 30 in the news. And the headline was, Circuit Court Scales Back Lower Court Decision, emphasizing the fact that it wasn't quite as many agencies that were doing this, rather than the sheer horror that a circuit court actually found that this behavior was going on. And so I wrote a piece about it. I posted it on my LinkedIn page. And it's there. If you go to LinkedIn and you look me up, you'll find it there. And I put the live links to both court decisions in the article that I wrote, kind of summarizing the story. So I invite every American to read it. I think it's important to read. I think it's a scary precedent to have been set. And don't rely on me. Click the links and read the decisions for yourself, and read them and realize that these were findings by not one but a number of judges. And the takeaway from this is not that one party is bad or one party isn't, or any of that. To me, once you allow any administration to begin to play games with the First Amendment and to begin to pressure private actors to do its bidding, it is a precedent that will continue, whoever is in charge of the country. And whichever side it ultimately winds up in, and who knows who'll be in the driver's seat in 2025 or 2029 or beyond. But if whoever's there is allowed to circumvent the protections of the First Amendment to censor speech that is not within the parameters of what it considers information, that it's what is the government decides is misinformation. Well, some of that information, as we look back on it, seems to have not been misinformation, and seems actually to have been the better information than some of the information that we were getting. So, I think we all need to be vigilant about that. And wherever you are in the political spectrum, and I think we all need to embrace each other now more than ever, to find common ground, to find not what makes us different from each other, which has been the focus of the last few years, but what makes us the same. What do we have in common? What are the common threads and the common bonds that make us Americans, that we share together? We've lost that, in the sake of celebrating our differences. Ultimately, we've lost the thread that binds us, and we need to get that back.
I mean, I think one can argue that freedom of speech is the most important freedom that we could have. I mean, it's the reason why it's the First Amendment. And I've felt it firsthand. I've had stuff labeled as medical misinformation and taken down. It's pretty wild. And I've seen my accounts get shadow banned at times. I went to school for computer science, and I can look at the analytics and see when an account's been shadow banned. But most people that wouldn't be aware of that type of stuff wouldn't know that they were. I don't know if you saw the Twitter file stuff, but I think it ties into that, where Elon Musk, talked to, like, he released some communications with federal agencies that were telling Twitter, it basically, and giving suggestions, as you say, of certain accounts that should be banned and information that shouldn't be allowed out. It's really wild, man.
Yeah, no. One of the sources I follow is the Free Press, which Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger, put information out there that is stuff that you won't necessarily find in the more mainstream media. And there is a lot of information from Matt Taibbi and the Twitter files that you'll find on that site, and on the different emails that they send out.
Well, those of us that are on social media and influencers, we talk behind the scenes, and we know that there are certain keywords that you can't say that will get flagged.
Right.
We know that. Right. So
hopefully we've avoided them in this podcast.
Yeah, I believe we have, but there are certain topics and keywords you say that will get you banned. It is just wild. It almost, like, I don't know, I know you got to go, but thoughts on how to protect people from this. Does there need to be a social media bill of rights or some sort of law protecting creators from this stuff? What's wild is that you can get banned and censored with no recourse. They can literally take you down and silence you without any recourse. Right.
Yeah. And I think things, at least as I see in the near future, are not going to get better. I think they're going to get worse. I know that there's an international coalition, I think, based out of Australia, that's really looking to create higher levels of censorship of social media and of the internet, in accord with other governments that are kind of joining together to decide what should and shouldn't be allowed to be said. Obviously, those other countries don't necessarily have something that is a counterpart to the First Amendment. Maybe they don't value free speech like we do in this country, freedom of expression. But to me, those are terrifying developments. I think the way that you deal with misinformation is to not censor it unless it's calling for extreme violence, or there's always exceptions. But in general, the way to deal with misinformation is by presenting truthful information, accurate information. And will somebody be allowed to put a blog up about how eating sawdust is all you really need for your nutritional health? I guess so, but calling that blog out and putting out health related, truthful, honest information to counter it is better than beginning to pick and choose what
Right.
to censor, because it really becomes a slippery slope, and ultimately whoever is in power can decide what their truthful narrative, what is information and what isn't, and can then suppress what is a healthy diversity of viewpoints. To me, the way we determine truth, the way we determine facts, the way we determine evidence is by having challenge from both sides. I come in the legal system. Our legal system is designed based on a system of adversarial attack, right? So I'm presenting one side, my opponent presents the other side, and the trier of fact has to determine what the evidence is. What do you rely on? And so by having both views rather than just one side presenting could you imagine a legal system in which only one side could be presented and the other side was censored from saying anything at all? I don't think that's conducive to truth. I don't think that works in a legal system, and I don't think that works on social media either.
Well, I mean, that's totalitarianism. That's what that is. I think this is another thing that people don't understand. I talk to other social media influencers, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the First Amendment applies to the government. It does not apply to corporate censorship.
Right. No, it doesn't. Private actors, whether they're corporations or individuals or local businesses or social media platforms, they're not bound by the First Amendment. You can choose to, I don't like what you said, or I'm going to make a rule. I can make a rule that in my workplace or my house, you can't say certain things, or I can throw you out. And, that's private rights. The First Amendment deals with what the government can do, but it gets, the problem is when the government begins to do indirectly what it can't do directly by maybe pressuring the corporations or pressuring social media to do its bidding for it.
And that's the real danger, that the government can be a proxy. And one could argue that these social media platforms hold more power than the government does when it comes to free speech, really.
Certainly there are people whose livelihoods are dependent now on their social media reach, and a restriction by a social media platform can put somebody out of business.
Yeah, I'm in that seat myself. Well, Rick, I appreciate you coming on. This was a very good conversation. Thank you for your time. Is there any parting words you want to leave us with? Anything you want to promote?
So definitely, just not promoting it, but I think every American should read those decisions. The links are on my LinkedIn. Anybody who has a platform, a web platform, who wants to share that article that I wrote with the links so that everybody can read the cases themselves, can reach out to me. I'm probably most active on Instagram at Rick Collins ESQ. So certainly I invite everybody to follow me, and I try to cover almost the sort of things that we've just spent the last hour talking about are kind of what I post about. So if you're interested in any of these issues, follow me on Instagram. Obviously, if anybody finds themselves in a legal or regulatory crisis of some kind, whether it's some sort of threatened lawsuit or a criminal accusation or being arrested or indicted, whether it's within the bodybuilding community or even outside it. My firm does work in the criminal defense sphere. I've had cases all over the country. I've actually, I think I counted the other day, I've practiced law in 41 different federal courthouses across the country, which may be a record. Most within my little wheelhouse of kind of health and fitness related issues, but certainly, if you're interested in reaching out to me for my legal services, you can go to rickcollins.com, which is my website for my federal defense practice. I've got a website at Supplement Counsel for all of my clients in the dietary supplement industry. And so you can certainly follow me there. Paul, I appreciate the conversation. We should do this more often.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.